A couple of weeks ago, we started a sermon series called Changing Your World. Thinking about how we can change our world and looking at a figure from the Old Testament. His name's Nehemiah. One of the books of the Old Testament is named for him. It's Nehemiah, and it's one of those that probably we don't spend much time looking at Nehemiah. It is probably one of the greatest leadership books that has ever been written. A lot of people have written leadership books using Nehemiah for different aspects, for churches, for Bible colleges, and also even for the corporate world, because there's a lot of those traits there that are so important that we see in that story or the events, the life of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah, we find him in the Old Testament. He's just an ordinary man. He's living in Susa, which is the capital city for Persia, the Persian Empire at that time. That would be in modern-day Iran. And he is Jewish, but he's a Jew that had never lived in Judea or in Jerusalem, because when you remember the history that took place, the children of Israel went against God. They divided into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom that was called Israel first was taken into exile way before the southern kingdom. And so his family would have been a part of the southern kingdom that eventually, because of their disobedience, God had Babylon come in and basically conquered them and took many of them into captivity for them to repent, but to come back. Not to destroy the nation, but to give them a whole fresh start. And so that would have been Nehemiah's family. But then as the Persians, the Medes and the Persians together conquered Babylon, then Persia is the main country. And that's where Nehemiah is. And one of the Persian kings by the name of Cyrus told the Jewish people they could go back home if they wanted to. Some of them did, many of them didn't, because many of them had never lived in Judea. Okay, it had been enough years. That's not really home anymore. That's where our ancestors, that's where grandpa and great-grandpa came from, but that's not home for me. So many of them stayed behind because they had jobs. That is where family was in Persia. People like Esther that we read about, she would have been one within this time period that their family stayed. That's the same way with Nehemiah. But he has some people coming from Judea, from Jerusalem. They came to Susa, and he wants to find out how things are going. Even though that's never been his home, that is still a very important place because he's Jewish. And so Jerusalem's pretty important. The temple is very important, and that whole nation is important to him. And so he just asked what's taking place. And he found out things weren't going very well. The walls of the city of Jerusalem have never been rebuilt. And until they are able to do that, they are really never a nation. Because all these warlords, like you read about, they were Samaritans like Sanballat and Tobiah. They came in all the time and they just plundered the places. They were kind of like, you might think of the mob. You had to pay money so that, okay, we'll defend you. That means they just wouldn't attack you. And you were constantly giving tribute to other people. And so the walls, it's been 140 years. The walls still have never been rebuilt. The temple, yes, not like Solomon's temple. A lot of their homes, a lot of their businesses, but really that whole nation could not flourish until they fortified their capital. And so he was sad. He was burdened when he heard that things haven't been fixed yet. Things aren't going very well. And so that burden for Nehemiah, it took an ordinary man and changed him into a world changer, but also a world-changing leader, okay, is what happened there. It changed him. So 2 weeks ago, we looked at this part of the transformation for Nehemiah. He's a cupbearer for the king, which means his job is to taste wine, okay? Probably not a very hard job, okay? It's just a job that there was a lot of trust in it because he made sure nobody was going to poison the king. So the king trusted him a lot, and he was around the king, even though really he's just a servant. But when he heard the news about Jerusalem and the wall, it says he sat down because of that burden and he cried. Then he knelt down to pray, and then he stood up to act. There are three very important things about being a world changer, especially a world changer for God, that there are things that sometimes bring a burden to us when we think of things within this world. And some things probably burden us more than others. And whenever we have that burden, it is good to go to God about it. God, how can this change? How can you use me? And spend much time in prayer, but then let God work through it and then act. And that's what Nehemiah did. He mourned over Jerusalem and the people of God. He prayed about the situation and he had a lot of prayer about it. And he stood up and acted. What he did is, because the king could tell there's something wrong with Nehemiah, he asked Nehemiah. Because the guy that's testing your food to make sure you're not going to die, when he's not looking well, you're probably going to ask him, what's wrong here, Nehemiah? Okay? And Nehemiah told the king that I want to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. See, this was a process. For him to get to that point, it was a process of crying, of praying, and then acting. And then Nehemiah changed his world. He changed his world. And that same process makes us become world changers as well, because God's got the power. A lot of times God needs the people that has a burden, that care the most about certain things. That's where God can work. So today we're going to learn about Nehemiah, how to be this type of a leader. Because in a sense, we're all called to be leaders. Like we were looking at in Sunday school, we're all called to be salt and light within this world. Okay, which means there are things that take place within our lives that show the divinity of God, which His divinity is within us. To be world changers. How to take dreams and turn them into realities. How to have a burden, but a burden's not enough. How to change a burden into ministry. And we can learn some important things from Nehemiah. First of all, define the mission clearly. That's the first step of a leader. Instead of just jumping into a whole bunch of things, you need to define the mission. I'm not sure if it's still taught this way, but it used to be taught if you're going to be a leader, like a president within a corporation, a CEO, or even a preacher, your first year is the most important. Do everything you can in your first year. I was told that by different people too. But as I also knew, because of being around the church, usually when that happens, that means the next year they're fired, okay, is what happens, okay? And you see that in the corporate world too. A lot of them get in there and they do as much as they can, and they don't even understand the company yet, right? You have to define a mission clearly, and so often you have to come into that mission to understand what really needs to be done. So it's not just doing a whole bunch of stuff, but it's what needs to be done. The first step, define it. And for us as Christians, is what specifically is God asking us, me, or you to do? Nehemiah chapter 2 and verses 4 and 5. It says, the king said to me, as Nehemiah is talking, what is it that you want? Then I prayed to God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, let him send me to the city of Judah, where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. So we see first, we need to see his commitment to prayer. Because he had already prayed a bunch. Then the king asked him what does he want, what's going on, and he prays some more. Okay? What he is doing is asking God to make sure the mission is clear, so that God's in it, so that God's working. He knew what he wanted to say, And he knew what he wanted to do, but he needed to pray, make sure this is what God wanted him to do. He prayed about it. And see, if our dreams and our plans don't need God, then they aren't going to be big enough to change probably us, much less change anything in the world. They got to be big enough that it takes God. Because if not, it's not going to change much. World-changing actions need God, and it needs leaders who are willing to pray. Nehemiah prayed, and he defined his mission clearly. He says, "Send me to the city of Judah, where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild the walls." That's pretty defined, isn't it? He didn't say, "Go send me and let me go check out the country." No, send me to the city, which is Jerusalem, okay? And let me rebuild it. Nehemiah was clear. He was clear. He didn't just want to go see. He didn't want to go check it out. He said, "I want to go rebuild." This is a clear vision that he has, and how important that is. That we have to refine the missions. Right? What does God want me to do? And not just a flurry of things, but what is God leading me to do? What does God want within that? Kind of an example. See, we can't be too vague, or probably nothing's going to happen. If you want to help people, and you say, "I think a way I could help people is by feeding the hungry." That's too vague. And the thing is, probably not much will be accomplished. It's too vague. There's a lot of hungry people. What does that mean? Or if it's that I have a vision for helping kids. Okay, that's not clear enough. That's too vague. It probably means very little will be done, and probably nothing that's world-changing. You have to dig deeper. And so often the digging deeper is spending time in prayer and allow God to guide us within that. Dig deeper and then start defining, what does this mean? What does this mean? Here's an example. Back when Shally and I, we started in the full-time ministry. The first ministry we went to was in Pleasant Hill, Illinois. And we had a burden for kids, okay? I was looking to go into the youth ministry. We had helped in churches we had been a part of, helping in kids areas and stuff like that. And that was really the burden. After I graduated from Central Christian College, I went to Ozark Christian College. They had a degree you could get in youth ministry, so I went and picked up some classes there. And so that's where my heart was, with kids. But we looked at youth ministries, and it kind of went this way. Either they were places we didn't want to go, or they didn't want us, okay? That was kind of the way it went. Or me. I shouldn't put that on Shally, okay? They didn't want me. But most of them is, a lot of our churches were just starting with youth ministers at that time. And so if you really enjoyed poverty, it would have worked very well, okay? But we couldn't find anything, and then we heard Pleasant Hill was looking for a preacher. We knew a little bit about the church because of some of the people we went to college with. That was home for them. And so I inquired. And so they had us come, and they said, yeah. Because really what they were looking for is a youth minister, but they didn't have money to pay a preacher and a youth minister. So here's a guy that's 23 years old, and we will hire him as our preacher so he can be our youth minister. And so that's what we went. And so we had a lot of different things to be a part of the church there, but the youth ministry was a big part of it too. And so we had a burden for kids. The town of Pleasant Hill is 1,100 people, so it's not a big place. And so our burden started to be defined a little clearer. We have a burden for the kids right here in Pleasant Hill. And so we prayed about it. And then one of the things we thought about is, why don't we use Vacation Bible School to start accomplishing that? And you go, wow, that's earth-shaking. Every church has Vacation Bible School, right? You know, it's not like it was anything new. They had Vacation Bible School there. But we said, this would be one of the ways to start. And so it helped us to have a clear vision, a defining vision of what will Vacation Bible School look like if we were really going to help kids and bring Jesus to kids. And then you pray about it. Because you can't underestimate what prayer does. Okay? Even something as Vacation Bible School. See, if we don't need to pray, our mission will not change us, and it probably won't change the world. To be a leader in a world-changing mission, you have to define your mission. What does God want me to do? And how does he want me to be involved within that? Then the second point, make plans carefully. We need to narrow down. You can't be vague. What is the next step? Right? I want to help people. I want to help kids. What's the next step? Because, see, that's really what leadership's about. Leadership is always not so much seeing the end result, is always seeing what is the next step. You may not know 10 steps down the road. You may not know 5 steps. But leadership is knowing the next step. Always, what is the next step that needs to be done? And so you start making careful plans with the next step. And once you define your mission, leaders begin to make plans and they say, what is then the next step? In many ways, careful planning is just determining what's the next step. What's the next step? Nehemiah had already done that. He had some careful planning. He didn't just tell the king, I want to go to Judea. No, he had the next steps in mind. I want to go by you sending me and to rebuild. Verses 7 and 8. It says, I also told him, he says, I told the king, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park or the forest, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was with me, the king granted me request. So you see, here is a cupbearer. He's a servant. But he has a plan. So when he goes and asks the king, send me to do this, he's already ready. But I will need a letter from you, king, so that I'm not killed on the way. It's 1,000 miles going through hostile territory. He knew he was just a servant. He's nobody. But if I have the letter from the most powerful man in the world at that time, I'm probably going to be all right. And so he asked for a letter. And the king gave it to him. Okay? He's going in behalf of the most powerful man in the world at that time to go build God's city back up. Also, he knew because the wall was down, he was going to need supplies. Now, a lot of the wall would be made out of stone. And because there was a wall there before, guess what? A lot of the stone's already there. He didn't have to worry about rocks. Okay, especially when you look at Judea. You don't have to worry about rocks. But what about wood? What about the gates to the city? And he knew where lumber came from at that time. It came from Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon. And so this is a part of the Persian Empire as well. And so he asked the king, said, will you give letters to the keeper of your park, the forest, so that I can have lumber? The king says yes. Isn't it cool that he even knew the name of who the guy was? How would he know that? Because remember, he was in on a lot of big things that took place. He's a servant standing in the shadows when the king is talking to very important people. So he knew who the movers and shakers were, okay? Because he was there. He overheard all these things. That's why the cupbearer is trusted for many reasons. And so he knew what was necessary. And so he had everything planned before he even asked the king of the next step. What's the next step? And then when he got to the city of Jerusalem, being protected by the king, He got there and he started making his plans to survey and to see the condition of the walls. And it says he went out at night to explore. Why at night? We don't know all the reasons why. Some of it, you're less distracted, right? There's not all the stuff happening. But also remember, there were hostile warlords around watching. And so he would not be detected going at night. He wouldn't have to worry about them. He wouldn't have them coming against his plan because they don't know his plan. So he's protected. But also one of the things you can do is you can see where people live. Okay? You can see the part of the wall that is the most important to other people. One of the reasons the wall never got rebuilt is because they would say, let's go to the east side and let's all try to build the wall. And then the bad guys, the Samaritans, would come in and I'm not going to stay here. I'm going to run back home. And so he's looking. What's going to be the most important part of the wall to you is the one by your house, right? Where am I going to do my best job in building a wall? It's the wall by my house. And so that's a part of his plan. He sees what part of the wall will be the most important to different people. And so he had them stay close to home. And while they're building, they had their sword there as well. So when the enemy comes, hey, I can protect my family, but also I can build most of the time too. So he surveys, and that's what his trip was about. It's what is the next step? What is the next step? And that's what we see Nehemiah keeps doing. And that's the key to planning. What is the next step? Back to Pleasant Hill. That was a burden for us, kids. But it also was neat. It was a burden for the church there too. What about all these kids? What about all these kids? And so it was time to have our meeting for Vacation Bible School for that year. It wasn't a meeting that I called. It was a meeting that they naturally had. But we were ready to share plans. And so at that meeting, we started sharing our vision of Vacation Bible School. And the neat thing is when you start sharing the vision, a lot of people had a bigger vision than what they had been doing. What about this? What about that? A lot of good things started to come together. And then it's just next steps. Some of them are easy. What's the date? That's not hard, right? Okay, how are we going to pick up all these kids in town? Because they're not coming. We've been doing Vacation Bible School for years. They're not coming, so we probably need to go pick them up. And so we came up with the idea back then to, every kid likes to have a hayride, so we had the tractors and wagon to go pick kids up in town. Let's try that. And then we want to have a big closing because we want to have as many people from the town come for the closing. That's when we started the turtle race. Let's do some big things so that people will come. And when it's out in our parking lot and the church was at the main intersection within town, people will see. So then you start lining up teachers and volunteers and materials and snacks and missionary and crafts, publicity. But all that to work, you need to have a director, right? You have to have a director that has that vision as well. And so guess who they picked? Shally, okay? Shally was the director, okay? So that works well, so we could be a team. And so how do you make it work when you're trying to do something bigger than you ever do before? You pick key people in charge of all those areas. And so usually it was working with 5 people because those 5 people were working with other people. You just have it worked through. So you make sure the vision and everything is shared with 5 people. That then in turn helps the whole church to see and to share within that vision. And so within a few weeks, a whole ministry was planned out and complete. It wasn't that hard. So what's your next step? Is it where you are right now to define your mission and clarify your vision? Or are you at the next step where you need to gather information? Are you at the point to recruit help? What's your next step? because that's important. Because everything that's going to change the world can't be done by yourself, right? Nothing that's really going to have an impact that goes way beyond can be done by ourselves. And that's the third point, to inspire people passionately. To inspire people. And that's where Nehemiah was. He took the next step. How do I inspire all these people that live here in Jerusalem to get this task done? Because until we get the wall, we can't become a nation. Because, see, no life-changing mission can be accomplished by ourselves. It takes God. That's why there's prayer. But also it takes other people, to enlist others, to share that passion with them so that they will be inspired to do their part as well. And see, a part of what he did is, why don't you build the wall by your house? Okay? Don't worry about what's going to happen to your family, because while you're putting up the bricks and the stone, keep the sword at your side. Sure, I can do that. I can do that. See, he didn't try to rebuild it by himself. He invited everyone to be a part of that. And so they do that. That they all start working on rebuilding the city. They all start doing that. And a part of the inspiration is Nehemiah himself. When you come from Susa with letters from the king, that kind of excites some people, right? Okay? You mean the king is willing to pay for stuff for us to rebuild? He is willing to stand with us. And so Nehemiah himself becomes a part of the excitement for the other people to come and get them involved. And once you start getting other people involved, it just keeps going and going, keeps trickling out to other people. Nehemiah's commitment and passion helped. And it's the same way with our commitment and passion. So often we'll help other people to come join with us. They may have had the burden, but they may have never taken the next step. But if someone shows them the next step, so often they'll come and be a part. So back to Pleasant Hill. We had a great vacation Bible school. We were there for 8 years. And each year it kept growing and growing and got better and better and better. We couldn't do one tractor and wagon. It took more than that. Because we have a lot of the country kids, they would meet at one of the places where one of the main roads came into town. They would meet in someone's yard there, one of the ladies at the church. They would be waiting to get on the wagon as soon as it came into town because they wanted their hayride as well. And so each year it kept growing and helping everyone within the church to be a part of it. And we saw that. One of the neat things, I'm not sure if you've ever seen this before, we even grew so much, we had senior citizens vacation Bible school. Okay? On the same block as the town is the Senior Citizen Center was there. And most of those that was a part of it was widow ladies from the church and other Christian churches. And so they were always doing stuff. We had more people baptized into Christ that were past retirement age than any age, because these ladies were dynamic, okay? And so I would go and play skip-bo with them sometimes, and so they said, why can't we have vacation Bible school as well? I go, that's fine. They said, we'll have it the same week. We'll have it in the afternoon. And so after they got done with the meal at the senior citizens, they set up for vacation Bible school. They taught the lesson. They took care of it. I would go to the nursing home and pick up people at the nursing home to bring them to it as well. They had a kick. It was a hoot, okay? And they had their craft. Their craft was they had the certificates for the kids. At the end of vacation Bible school, they colored them and did all this type of stuff. This was neat. They were helping with vacation Bible school. And so we had a great senior citizens vacation Bible school as well at the same time. That was easy to do because they had the vision. They had the vision. And so it just kept growing. And it kept getting bigger, our vacation Bible school, that other people would call and say, now, we're going to do something this summer. When is your vacation Bible school? Because they didn't want to interfere because they wouldn't have any kids, okay? And so we always said, it's first week in August. We'll never change it, Okay, first week in August. So we won't play games, moving it here and there. That's when it's going to be. And so people were happy. What was the benefits? Well, the church grew. The youth group grew. The youth group grew to have a big impact within the community. By the time we left, we had a lot of the kids from the school. We had a lot of the sports kids, and so when you have the quarterback, it's pretty easy to have prayer before a game out on the field because he led it, okay? We had devotions in the high school. I never went because they took care of it, okay? I never knew what all they did because they took care of it in the high school. The kids did. And it just grew and grew to have more and more impact. You know what happened 20 years later? We were only there for 8 years. 20 years later, a lot of these little kids that we picked up with a hay wagon, their families never came to church, okay? But a lot of them, when they got married and they started having little kids, they remembered a church that loved them. And we want our families to be different than the family we grew up in. So guess where they went to church? As these young 20-some-year-olds. We're going to Pleasant Hill Christian Church because they love us. And so we had been gone for a lot of years when that started taking place. A lot of these little kids that had grown up to start coming and being part of. Because see, leadership isn't what you do in the first year. It's the impact that you have that keeps on going and going is what happens. It's important. Just something little as a vacation Bible school that we didn't want it to be the same. But you have to keep the vision. It's been about 40 years now since that started. Okay? You got to keep the vision. Nehemiah was not a professional speaker. Okay? He drank wine for a living. Okay? That was Nehemiah. He probably wasn't the smartest guy in the room, but he was the guy that cared the most. And that's what makes the difference. He was the guy that cared the most. He had never even lived in Judea, but he cared more than the people that lived there to get that wall done. He cared the most. And then he made it clear what needed to happen. He enlisted others with the vision. And in chapter 2 and verse 18, it says, they began this good work. Okay? This is something God wanted to take place. God wanted them to be a nation once again. So they began the good work. And so together they started rebuilding the walls. It's been 140 years. And it took them 52 days to rebuild the wall. 52 days. Because he became someone that had a burden. He took that burden to God. And God, how can you use me? And after he kept praying and praying and continued to pray through the process, he stood up to do. 52 days. And we'll keep seeing more things. He becomes the governor and all this type of stuff. That great things continue to keep happening. 52 days. Because God's hand was in it. God's hand was upon Nehemiah. And there's a lot of things whenever we have a burden when we look at this world. So often it is God helping to place a burden on us. It's things that God sees that aren't the way it should be and something needs to change. And we as salt and light, with God's divinity within us, he wants to work through us. He wants to work through us to be world changers. To be world changers. So as the worship team comes up, I want to just share a few more thoughts. See, to turn our burden into mission that can change our world, we don't need to be the smartest. At least it used to say most CEOs and presidents of companies, most of them were C-average students. You don't have to be the smartest. For those in school, do your best. I'm not saying C's, okay? You don't have to be the most talented. You don't have to have the most resources, but you need to care the most. It's caring the most that makes a big difference, because caring the most will take you to prayer, where you ask God to help, and then you allow God to start helping you to define that mission. How can it be accomplished with the next step? Okay? The next step. It's not the end result. It's not everything you wanted. Because see, the next step for Nehemiah was to build a wall. There's things that kept happening through him, but this is what he wanted. You don't have to plan everything. And then, because of your care, passion is coming through you, and passionately invite other people to be a part of it, to join in, to be a part. If we learn how to do this, we all can become leaders of God that change the world. One of the things that Ozark Christian College, they have done for a lot of years, they have little films that's entitled Just One. And it shows what some of their alumni have done. And it's just some of them, just one. Some of them, it may be hundreds of churches in a country that was started because one person went there. It may be healthcare things. It may be a lot of different aspects from just one person. See, God hasn't changed. God still takes people that care the most, that turn it over to God to pray about, but then stand up, right? Stand up to do what God wants. How cool. How cool. And that's for all of us. So we're going to sing a song together, which always is a time of reflection, of commitment. God, what do you want me to do next? Right? What do you want me to do next? So let's stand together. We're going to sing and just let God guide our hearts and minds.